my name is Dr. Suraya Scheba. I'm a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. I have been there since 2015, and my research is predominantly within urban spaces. So I'm very interested in the production of the urban, with a specific interest in how we can think both about the structural factors that inform ongoing inequality as well as questions around how to imagine and construct alternative, more emancipatory futures. So that's the broad intent that I have. I've predominantly worked within Cape Town, but I increasingly am doing comparative work across cities of the Global South and the Global North. And in this case, empirically, I focused on water provisioning and struggles over water access, and more so around access to housing, and the occupation of both land and buildings as an attempt to claim the city or claim the right to the city, and a refusal of dispossession in urban spaces. So I think it's very interesting and important to think about our positions as researchers in relation to the work that we do. So often when we do research, we suggest that there's a detachment in the work, and that we should simply focus on the rigor of scholarship. But I think as much as we should advance and emphasize rigor, we should also really pay attention to our own identity and how our own identity and positionality in the world over time, as we've been shaped over time, informs what we come to ask. And I think that there's a clear connection between my upbringing and the ways in which I've come to see the world as a woman of color in South Africa, specifically in the context of a transition into a post-apartheid South Africa, is when I really came into political awareness, and began to grapple with these questions of what apartheid produced and what post-apartheid means. I think this was very central to my upbringing, to my own identity, to my own experiences of this transition. And these are really the things that at the core informed the questions that I ask as a scholar, because I recognize that what we call post is incomplete. I've experienced that both at a very personal, embodied level as a brown woman, but I've also witnessed it in my society. And so the questions that I ask as a scholar around the grappling with this question of how do we really realize the promise of the post in a much more complete way as opposed to a negotiated settlement. So in that sense, my scholarship is as much about the rigor of the work as it is about engagement and active immersion of myself in the spaces where I conduct my research, where I think about the people that I work with as both people I am conducting research with as much as people I am co-engaging and thinking with, and effecting some mode of change collectively. Okay, so as I said, I began doing my work in the city of Cape Town, but if the question is around emancipatory futures, I think it's important to think both in very situated ways, looking at the context in which the work is being done, and to think about connections. So how do we go from the situated to the abstract and don't treat these as in some way opposed to each other? And for that reason, I do think that comparative work is very important because it helps to support conversation. So when I think about comparison, I'm not looking for mirroring understandings of one place as equivalent to another, but translation. So increasingly, the more I've been thinking about this work, it's around translation. It's not just language translation, but translation of context, translation of understanding, and what that allows us to understand from one context to another, and equally draw lessons, both as scholars, but also in the sharing of these practices so that they can inform movement practice and strategy to advance different kinds of possibilities and futures. So that's the intent in working comparatively. And here I think really about the work of Gillian Hart, which I find really useful. She talks about relational comparison and conjunctural analysis, where there's a focus on moments in time and events in a way that comparisons or conversations, dialogues are drawn to make sense of places in relation to each other, but not to suggest equivalence. So that's the bigger picture of why I'm trying to do this kind of work, and why Brazil, or we've also been doing work in Bogota, in Colombia. In some ways it's also about relationships. So as a researcher, I have existing relationships both with Stella and others who have been working in Sao Paulo, and with a scholar who's been working in Bogota. And so through friendships, through relationships, we began to design this project in an attempt to mobilize a dialogue. And then on the question of what do we see when looking at the occupation practices in South Africa, in Cape Town, relative to what's happening in Sao Paulo, I think one of the significant differences is, from my understanding, inner city occupations have a much longer history in Sao Paulo, and there's much more, the range of buildings and possibility is far more extensive. So in South Africa, historically, we have largely seen the occupation of peripheral lands, and it's only in the last few years that a movement called Reclaim the City has occupied 2 buildings in the inner city. So Sissigul House, where I've done a lot of my research, and Ahmed Kathrada House. And in this case, it's an attempt to push against the lack of affordable housing in the city, as well as gentrification. But it's more the exception than the norm. And I think it's interesting to think around what these practices have looked like, and the labor that has been involved in sustaining and maintaining those occupations, both as a site of everyday life making as well as a site of political claim making, how this is unfolded, and to do that in a conversation with the practices in Sao Paulo. And here we've really focused on occupation Mauá, where Stella has worked extensively, and there are strong parallels there. So that's how we've been trying to do the work, but it's informed both by an awareness of the differences in the larger politics, as well as what those everyday practices and political claims look like. And if I could add one more point, the other thing that we've been interested in is trying to understand how these claims work in relation to state, to the state and notions of the state, as well as state instruments. And I think in this case, the relationship between movements and the Workers' Party here in Sao Paulo is quite interesting to think about, and how this supports notions of regularization, which in the South African case we've not really been able to realize as yet. So this is another way in which we're trying to think about lessons that can be drawn across sites, and how that can inform movement strategy as well as scholarship and understanding as scholars. Okay, so I arrived at Unicamp almost 2 weeks ago, and I've been here for the last 2 weeks. I've given 3 lectures. Today would have been the 4th, but we have postponed because Stella is not well. But each of the lectures has focused on trying to spell out the story from the South African context around land and housing struggles, and locating that historically as a way in which to trace these struggles, not as just a contemporary understanding of housing crisis, but actually how these have evolved over time, and how we should think about the present also in relation to the past. So I began by telling a story around land and housing struggles from the colonial period into apartheid, as a way in which to firstly recognize how the notion of private property is itself a colonial construction. And so there's an intimate connection between ideas of private property, the way in which the law comes to be utilized to institutionalize private property, and how this in itself is very much a racialized construction. So it enables the differentiation of humanity in a way, and the production of a hierarchy of race in the South African context. But I think that's very much a story of a global anti-blackness, when we think about colonialism and slavery and what that history suggests. But my story is really focusing on South Africa in order to explore that. But I think what I was trying to do, beginning with the first lecture, is to really provoke the students to recognize that that story of the past is not just about the past, but how should we really think in much more, in a temporality that is not only linear, but actually to suggest that we need to pay attention to how the past lingers. So in telling the story of instruments really of dispossession, I wanted us to then move into the second class, focusing on the post-apartheid moment, always drawing connections between what was told, what I had tried to explore of the moment up until the end of apartheid, and what the post-apartheid moment seems to suggest, but also never fully realizes. So in focusing on land and housing then, I guess I'm really interested in making apparent both how we think about structural dispossession as racialized dispossession and racialized violence, and how that is both something that is undone or resisted in various ways, but also lingers in many ways. So we're sitting with this tension between a racialized violence and harm and ongoing efforts towards a push towards liberation and freedom. And I try to locate that in the story of land and housing in the South African context, but I think that it has resonance all over the world, and these are the kinds of the questions we should be grappling with more broadly. So those were the types of things that I tried to focus on in the workshop. In the last session that I gave, which was 2 days ago, I also tried to sit with the students to think about not only these bigger academic questions and how thinking about this through the entry of the city is also about thinking about how we construct the world, questions around world making. I wanted to ask the question of how do we insert ourselves as scholars within this question of world making. So how do we move beyond being observers, which is what academia almost trains us to do, and how do we think about our bodies and ourselves and our active immersion in these practices, not only as scholars but as human beings working with people who struggle, whose life is defined by struggle but structurally produce struggle. So what is the ethical imperative is what I'm trying to say in conducting this type of work as a scholar. And so I spent quite a bit of time in the last lecture talking about notions of engaged scholarship, and essentially arguing that if the focus on occupation practices as practices of transgression, of disruption, of really rupturing the normalization of private property and the racialized dispossession that this has instituted, if that is the focus in the research on occupations, then I think the other provocation is to think around how engaged scholarship should mirror that. So what is the mirroring? And I think that if occupations are transgressive and insurgent in some way, engaged scholarship should also be thought about as in some way transgressive and insurgent, transgressing what is being normalized in our institutions, which is increasingly a movement towards the neoliberalization of academia. And what does that ask of us as scholars? How do we make the university in ways that really centers the question of ethics, about morality, about justice? And I think that this is really what should be asked of the university and what should be asked of us as scholars. In the process of knowledge production, we should be producing knowledge that is also transformative in the world. And these are really the things that I focused on during the lectures. I also gave a talk where I tried to unpack several of these questions in much more detail, but focusing on the site we have done most of my work in Cape Town, called Sissi House, which is the occupation of an abandoned building, which used to be a hospital but stood vacant for around 25 years when it was occupied as a political act, as an act of claim making, but a site that has since, over the last 7 years, become a home. So it's both about homemaking and life making. But in this talk, I was trying to explore how the practices that are unfolding at the site offer lessons around how we can make different kinds of worlds. So I try to think about occupations, whilst not trying to romanticize occupations, try to think of occupations as also offering lessons on these reparative practices as reparations. what can we learn from occupations is really the question that I'm asking, but focusing on this one site to draw more expansive lessons. And can I continue? Okay. So that's what I've been doing at the university. But I've also spent time in Sao Paulo with Stella. We spent several days in Sao Paulo. Specifically, we visited UFABC, yes. We already have had interactions with some of the scholars at Lab Juta, where they focus on questions on territorial justice. And they have done a lot of work specifically with the Observatory of Evictions, and I was trying to understand the work that they were doing, how they conducted that work, what questions they were asking, the different methods that they used, how it was transdisciplinary. So again, this point that I was making around comparison and dialogue and exchange is about exchange around practices, both scholarly practices as well as occupier practices, and how we can take these lessons and translate them and move them across space. So we spent quite a bit of time then in Sao Paulo, both visiting Occupation Mauá and speaking with people at Lab Juta to look at occupation practices and scholarly practices. So that's what I've largely been doing over the last 2 weeks. So I've had an amazing experience here. It's been 2 weeks. It's been very intense. Every day has been very, very busy, but wonderfully stimulating. So I feel like each day I was adding a little bit more of a layer of understanding of how Sao Paulo and Brazil more broadly, aspects of it that I've been reading about but have not really had a chance to really explore and see and feel myself. And so I've really enjoyed the experience. I felt very welcome by both the students and the community here at IFCH. And it was wonderful to have time to spend with Stella as well, who I've been working with for several years, but actually largely through a distance relationship. So to be able to spend time together and talk and really reflect on the connections between these spaces that we work in has been a wonderful opportunity. I've very much enjoyed the interaction with the students. They've all been very engaging, very respectful, and even though in the class we've had to work with actual translation in terms of moving between English and Portuguese, in each of these sessions everyone has been very attentive and respectful, and I found the questions really stimulating. So overall I've really, really enjoyed the experience, and I think it's also so important that spaces like this exist and that there is support for scholars from different parts of the Global South to visit each other, because in a conversation that we've had, that I had both at UFABC and here, I think there's a recognition that when people from the Global South talk about conditions within the Global South, there's a much more of an ease of an understanding. We don't need to do multiple levels of explanation in understanding the conditions that we are referring to. And I think that creating these spaces of exchange are really, really so important in building understanding, in building change, in building scholarship. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. I've fully enjoyed it, and I hope that the reverse can happen as well relatively soon. So thank you.